The Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College presents Liberty Mail with the Student Fellows of Faith and Freedom.
Welcome back to another episode of Liberty Mail. I'm Libby Krieger, and today we don't have Aaron Jenks, but we do have a special guest with us, Grace Riley. So Grace is a sophomore here at Grove City College, and she is also a Turning Point USA ambassador. She has a lot of social media and communications experience. She's a conservative social media influencer, and especially I wanted you here, Grace, to get your take on where Gen Z is at. So we can get into that later, but first of all, if you just want to tell me a little bit about your political experience and how you got involved.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, Libby. This is just such a great show, and I'm so happy to be on it. And yeah, so I got involved back in 2018, and throughout my life, I've been interested in politics. And as a kid, I like to say I always wanted to sit at the adult table at family functions. I was just always interested in talking about important issues in the world, even back when I maybe didn't understand everything that was going on. But in high school, back in 2018, I became more interested and got more involved, and I decided to go to the High School Leadership Summit, which was a Turning Point USA event. And through that, I became inspired by hearing so many amazing speakers, conservative speakers, and by meeting so many other young students, and just kind of seeing how much hope there was in the conservative movement, and it really inspired me to get involved. So through there, I decided to start speaking out on social media, and I made my own social media account and started posting political things and really started pursuing that. And I kept going to conferences and events, and just through that, I kept learning more and getting more involved. And through that even I started working in the movement, where I worked for Young Americans Against Socialism for about a year doing social media, where we focused on socialism and Run Gen Z and on how we could reach Run Gen Z with the truth about socialism. And through that, I also worked for Arsenal Media for about 6 months, where I worked on conservative campaigns and on reaching just the general American population with conservatism and conservative values in campaign seasons.
Wow, that is a long, amazing resume. So much experience to go off of and take experiences and opinions from. So I'm really excited for our conversation today, especially because we're both Gen Zers, I believe, yeah. So what people call the Zoomer generation. And so I think I want to know especially, how do you think conservatives can better appeal to young people, especially in this Gen Z generation?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and one as conservatives that is so important that we focus on, because there really is a bit of a gap between Gen Z and conservatism, I think. But I also think on the other side of that there are so many young conservatives, and Run Gen Z is said to be the most conservative generation since World War II. So with that, I think that there's a lot of hope and a lot of young conservatives that maybe don't speak out because they're scared to us in their schools and just
scared
environment.
Of ostracism?
Yeah, because today in the culture, it's not easy to speak out as a young conservative, and that does make you a rebel in this culture, because predominantly the culture is secular and on the left. So it's really difficult for most young people to speak out against maybe their friends or just the whole entire world around them that seems to be left. But I think there are so many more young conservatives than we know, and that's really inspiring, I think, for all of us. But I do think, too, that the education system is a really big issue, where the education system is predominantly left. And with that, it's important to realize that kids from when they're in elementary school to the university levels are going through these leftist education systems, which are not helping with that either. And that's something as conservatives that I think we need to be really aware of and working to kind of fight back against.
Exactly. And I think we kind of just saw that happen in Virginia, which I think was very interesting. We talked about this on the podcast a few weeks ago, but how that was such a litmus test for the fact that the culture war is still alive, and Americans still really do care what their children are being taught in schools. And critical race theory and transgenderism, all those big culture movements which we've been told are not important, I think will maybe be defining features for this new upcoming generation of conservatives. And so I think social media, which is an area which you have spent a lot of time and experience in, I think that's an area where we can totally capitalize as conservatives and try to get our message out better to these young conservatives, because I think so much is there's a predominant narrative, which you mentioned, on social media, which is consumed by the leftist progressives and the legacy media, which pushes that same narrative. So if we are able to, as conservatives, kind of have our own lane in social media and really try to use that to our benefit, I think maybe conservatives, like you said, will be less scared to come out against the predominant narrative and actually stand for what they believe in. And I think that, at least in my opinion, social media is somewhere we can totally capitalize on.
I would totally agree with that, and I think that social media is an incredible tool for conservatives to use, and that conservatives have been using just through reaching young people and reaching, whether that's people that disagree and maybe are more on the left, or by inspiring young conservatives. I think social media is the way in a lot of ways.
It has so much potential.
Yeah, it really does, and it's really the way where conservatives can kind of enter into the culture and be sharing their values and ideas. And I think the other important thing to recognize is that so many young people aren't even exposed to conservative ideas. It's something where maybe if you were to share a conservative post on your social media, for a lot of young people, that's kind of the only time that they've ever heard something like that, because the culture is so dominated by the left.
Exactly. And I know you are very active on Instagram at Conservative Grace. Everyone follow her there. I know you. Do you have a Twitter too, Conservative Grace?
I do. That's at Conserve Grace.
Oh, Conserve Grace. Awesome. Yeah, I know one of my friends who is from the Northern Virginia area, so a predominantly liberal area. Her coming to Grove City, it was such a culture shock because never before had her social media had any difference of opinion, and had been so much just the leftist talking points. And I think for her to come to Grove City, an area, and at least kind of get some more conservative contacts was really eye-opening for her, and something that I think if people were just exposed more to those ideals, that they would be more open to it and could have a civil conversation rather than always having the other mentality of, if I'm a liberal, oh, those conservatives, those are just like the other people that the racist and bigot. And I think it's lots of times this bigot or progressive binary where if you're not progressive, you are a bigot. And so I think that is something that happens because we are so polarized and so just in an echo chamber of our own beliefs. And I'm sure that happens to conservatives too. Like it's not just a one-sided thing. But yeah, if we can have more influence on social media, and some organizations have done very well. And I know Turning Point you're very involved with. They have a really big social media following.
Yeah, I think Turning Point has done a great job on social media engaging young people, as well as having conferences where young people can go and meet each other and also hear from so many of the biggest conservative speakers. So I think Turning Point has done an excellent job in that way, and on social media making conservatism cool. Yeah. Because that's not necessarily what we think of when we think of conservatism.
Think old white rich man.
We think of traditional values, which maybe doesn't for young people come off as the coolest. Come off as the coolest thing or resonate as well. But I think Turning Point USA and a lot of conservative advocates on social media are now doing a really great job by presenting conservatism as cool and marketing it that way to young people, which is a really great thing. And I agree, too. I went to a more leftist high school and middle school, so I grew up in a school system, and I grew up in Connecticut, which is a very blue state. So from my background, I was always around kids that were predominantly liberal and around teachers that were predominantly liberal, and just that environment as a whole. So coming to Grove City, I had the same experience where now I was blessed to be surrounded by more conservatives. But on top of that, definitely as a young conservative in maybe a more liberal high school, it's so hard to stand up and be that one voice on social media or otherwise. But I think it's so important to recognize how important and valuable those voices are for people that do stand up. Because you're right, where you were saying that your friend would only see one side on social media back at home, and that's just the reality in so many places where it really is that way. Especially I think back to when the black squares were being shared, that was the only stream of things.
Exactly.
And that's just an example of how those posts go viral on the left, and they're the only
and then
side
it becomes groupthink too.
It does, yeah. And I think the other important thing to realize, especially with socialism, what's interesting is that our young people polls show are predominantly more favorable and open to socialism than they are to free market capitalism, which I think says a lot. But what's interesting about that, I think, is that so many young people don't actually know what socialism is, which polls also show. So I think that opens a lot of hope for us to be able to reach them with the truth. But it does say a lot where a lot of young people are in support of these ideologies but don't truly understand the impact or effects that they will have here in America.
And I think you made a good point about knowing exactly what the ideology is. So something that Aaron and I have focused on this show is asking people what's the man on the streets, what is conservatism? So I'd ask you, what is conservatism? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I would say to me it means really a value system. It's a lot more than just a set in stone political ideology that you can just define. I think it's defined by limited government, by traditional American values, by Christianity involved in it. So to me, it's really those values, and it's also how you live your life. It's more than just a political ideology. It's really how you live your life and how those values define it, both in the political sphere and just otherwise.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what you touched on in the aspect that Christianity is so involved, and that's why here at the Institute for Faith and Freedom, we know faith and freedom are inseparable, and that's something that we had Dr. Ken Gore's class on American conservatism last year together, and actually with Aaron, and we talked about that a lot. And something that we've seen when asking people about conservatism, we would ask some leftist students, and they see it as a racist or bigoted, sometimes traditional is what they say. Really interesting to hear their perception of it. But then some conservative students who define themselves as conservative reduce it to purely economic terms. And that's also not conservatism in the true sense. So I really like your definition there. I think it's spot on. But to get more into this socialism point, I know you have some statistics on that you've cited some polls. Why do you think young people are so interested in socialism or so open to it whenever this is something that just years ago, back at the fall of the Berlin Wall, people were very skeptical of it, and as they should have been?
Yeah, well, I would say that I think it's insane that so many young people are open to socialism.
That's a word.
And again, as I said, more young people are favorable and open to socialism than they are to free market capitalism here in America today. And that's a really telling statistic.
That's concerning.
Yeah, it really is, especially considering that socialism, communism, Marxism, all one and the same, have led to disaster and just societies breaking down into shambles everywhere they've been tried throughout history. Yeah. So with that just deadly history of socialism, communism, Marxism, it's insane that young people here in America would be open to that, especially since we're so lucky to be in America, where it truly is the land of the free. And even as Reagan said, it really is the last stand on earth, where it's rare. America is rare to have this freedom and to have the ability to even have these political conversations. In so many other places, and in socialist and communist countries included, you can't have this free exchange of ideas and conversations. And I think a lot of young people don't realize that. And really the biggest point is that so many young people don't truly understand what socialism would mean for our country. I think ideas sound nice to young people because, of course, we want free college, we want this, we want that.
The entitlement mentality.
Exactly. And that's how our culture has kind of raised us to be in a way, I think, as young people. But with all that considered, those ideas don't actually end up working the way that young people maybe assume that they will.
Exactly.
And they really do lead to economic disasters and just would lead to poverty in our country, among other things. Socialism has failed every time it's been tried everywhere. And I think if more young people realize that reality, that less young people would support socialism. And I think on top of that, again, I think the education system has really fed into that.
Definitely.
Because not just in universities, we talk a lot about universities and all the Marxist professors and Marxism being taught in universities and how far left they've gone. But it's important to realize, too, that stems back into high schools, middle schools, elementary schools, and is really prevalent throughout the education system, just completely throughout the education system.
I know. I saw that personally in my own experience. In high school, I was taught a lot about Hitler and fascism, which obviously is very important to teach. But we had such a small unit on socialism and Mao Zedong and Stalin and Lenin, and I just think it's insane that we devote so much time to fascism while giving only a quarter of it to socialism. Whatever communism, I mean, that's the next step after socialism, has killed 100 million people, if not more. And I think so. We just have not enough being taught about socialism in schools. And I had another class in high school, and I went to a fairly like middle of the line, either conservative or moderate kind of high school, public school. And one of my classes taught a lot about like cultural relativism and ethnocentrism, which maybe it's not a bad thing to teach that, but whenever it was in the framing of the United States has done everything wrong and we need to understand other cultures by their own morals. Like, no, maybe we should have a transcending moral order that is just moral absolutes. So again, I think you touched on that really important issue. And something else that you said is I think we are so lucky to be Americans. And sometimes I think about it. There's like 7 billion people on this earth and 330 million Americans. Like, we are so lucky to have been born in this country, or if not born, but just to live here now and be afforded these freedoms that we are in this country.
Absolutely. And I think, too, we really just are. And I think that ungratefulness is something that is a huge problem in our country, especially in the secular culture. But I really think we should all be so grateful to live in America, because so many more people are worse off across the world.
Yeah. And something else with cultural Marxism. I know that you recently, I believe, put out a video on Conservative Grace about this. And it's something that we were taught a little bit in my Marxism class with Dr. Kengor. And I think this is where we're seeing Marxism most prevalent today in American society. When you look at someone like Herbert Marcuse or Antonio Gramsci, really, they understood that the battle in the West could not be a solely Marxist in the sense of economic terms, where you think of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie clashing in the typical sense of Marxism, but they understood that they had to apply that same oppressed mentality to culture. And I think that's like Critical Race Theory, the perfect example of that. And that's kind of where we're seeing with the understanding of cultural Marxism, you have to infiltrate the institutions of the West. So like education is a big one. Religion is also a big one. The family, the media, entertainment. And you're seeing all of these institutions being either torn down, like the family, abolition of the family is a huge thing in Marxism, or just like higher education is predominantly taken over by progressives. And so you're seeing that really truly play out right now in America. And it's something that, because we're not taught about cultural Marxism from a young age and taught about the dangers of communism and Marxism, I think many Americans are totally blind to it. And that's one of the most concerning things.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that's so true that so many Americans don't even recognize what's happening. And there's a quote that a lot of Americans, I think it's Thomas Soule, that really Americans won't understand what's happening until it's already happened.
Until it's too late.
Yeah, until it's too late and until America has changed forever. So I think that's why, too, for conservatives, it's so important that we really use our voices in the best ways that we can to reach those people that maybe just don't understand what's happening or don't see what's happening. And that's a lot of people, because you're right, we aren't taught at a young age about the reality of Marxism and cultural Marxism. As you said, Marxists understand that they have to target the culture.
They're
and that
smart, unfortunately.
They are, yes, and that it's a cultural battle, not just an economic one, and that if they can win people over in the culture by dismantling the family, targeting religion, or infiltrating the education system, through all of those things and the things you've mentioned, even in the entertainment industry, we see the sexual revolution.
Exactly.
All these different things are ways
all
that
playing out.
It is. It's all playing out, and these are all tactics and tools used by Marxists to influence people and then kind of bring them over so that they can be more easily controlled. Because people without meaning are easy to control, and that's what Marxists need to be able to take power and have their ideology take root.
Yeah, do you have any resources you can give to people to, if they don't know a lot about Marxism or the dangers of that, or socialism, anything like that? I can give some too, but you're very well read in this area. So I was wondering if you have any books or other resources.
I would say definitely to check out Paul Kengor's Communism book. I would say for me that's been such an instrumental
The Devil and
tool.
Karl Marx? Is that-
Devil and Karl Marx and his just book on communism,
Okay.
The Guide to Communism. That's a great book. So both by Paul Kengor, those are excellent books to check out.
Definitely.
Also, I would definitely read books like The Road to Serfdom and other foundational books like that can kind of help build your knowledge from a foundational level. Those things all help. And I think also importantly, focusing on your foundation, if that's conservatism, focusing on the foundation of what those principles and values are is the way to start, not with current events necessarily, but just focusing on that foundation and then applying it to
because it's all an
current events.
outgrowth of your foundation and your values at the end of the day. Something I'd add is Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. I'm sure they have a lot of great resources. They're the ones who kind of looked at the research and said, okay, probably about 100 million. Lee Edwards at the Heritage Foundation, he I believe is the head of that organization. They are great. Also, I think just reading like the Communist Manifesto or some of these writings by Herbert Marcuse or Antonio Gramsci to really understand what we're up against, because they understood they had a misunderstanding of human nature in some ways, but they understood how to manipulate. And so I think if we can understand what we're up against, we can better combat it in our messaging as well. So along with what you said, I think those would be some good reads. And last thing that I want to talk about today is something that I know you touched on a little bit before, but how conservatism is how we live in our daily lives too. I think sometimes there's a lot of disconnect between what young conservatives, especially, I know like I've seen this, what we say and then how we act. And I think it's so important to along those lines, why faith and freedom are interconnected. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think it makes me sad to see a disconnect with young conservatives in the way that they act and the values that they believe in or preach. And I think living by the values under conservatism and Christian values under the wing of Christianity, I think really making Christianity and your mission, and then from that, I believe conservatism kind of stems in.
Exactly.
But I really think that faith should be the center of how we live, and then again, politics comes after that. But by focusing on those values and just practically focusing on having a family, avoiding hookup culture, and other things like that are in the secular culture and that are breaking down the family, I really think focusing on those values and doing our best to live out what we preach in the best way that we can is the best thing.
Exactly. And as Christians and conservatives, we should be, I believe as Jonathan Edwards said, a shining city on a hill. And so that, I think, is the biggest thing that we can do as conservatives too, is just to show we're actually living this out. We truly believe this, because if we believed it, we would live it. So again, great point, Grace. Thank you again so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
And if you want to hear more from Liberty Mail, make sure you subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, wherever you're watching or listening. Share it with your friends. We'd really appreciate that. And then we'll see you here next week for another episode.
Thank you.
For more information on this podcast or other programs, please visit faithandfreedom.com.